Great. Brad and Howard, thanks for inviting us here to talk about a few different things. I'm going to, based on some questions we've gotten from you, get a little nerdy here, if that's all right, and get into the science behind smoky. I'm glad Eric's here because he's as big a nerd as I am on it, so is Adam. But so please jump in, Eric. When we see a smoky sign telling us one thing or another, what does that mean and how does that change what we're doing as far as preparation? And are we just going out and looking at the woods and snapping a twig and saying, I think it's high today? It's way more than that. And I'd also like to briefly segue into fire restrictions, because that's going to be an interesting topic this summer, right, Jim? With the county looking at possibly tightening them up, and the UCR, the Upper Colorado River, is looking at changing things a little bit. So this is perfect timing for our summer. So with that, if I can figure this out, first some fun. That's the original Smoky. That's the original Smoky. Steve Lipsher has some trivia, Steve, on Smoky. If you need to write Smoky a letter and complain.
Yeah, actually, Smoky was such a popular figure and such a great marketing tool for the Forest Service to promote wildfire or campfire safety that he received literally millions of pieces of mail and has his own zip code in Washington.
Yeah. So when you write Smoky, use the right zip code. And then just to add a little levity to things, there's times when, I don't know if you can see that, Smoky's got issues. There's a flood. Fortunately, that says low and not high. But there's a little more science behind some of this as we'll get into it. First, I want to point out some of the relevance to the Smoky sign and fires we've had here in Summit County. Where is this? Behind the high school, September 05, I think it was. Smoky was moderate that day. Only moderate, and look at the intensity of the fire. And these, I put some here. I didn't know what Dan was going to show, but this is perfect because he had a good lead into this. We never know where the fire is going to start or which way it's going to go. If you can predict the wind and the weather each day, I take my hat off to you, but we don't know where the fire is going to start and where is it going to go. And each of these larger fires in our county have presented different tactical problems. What was the problem here? Power lines, Highway 9 right here, a high school right here that was just getting out, and the Alpensee subdivision right up here. So every fire has its own unique challenges, and this is a good segue into where we're going. So Ophir Mountain, September, Smoky was moderate. Where's this? We're standing in Safeway parking lot, looking west. That's Buffalo, Interstate, and this is Meadow Creek subdivision. That was, Smoky was moderate. Started by a squatter camp. There's a lot of squatters back there. And that presented some tactical challenges. Why? Because the smoke started to bank down across the interstate. That's bad, all right? State needs to keep the interstate open, but when visibility gets to zero, then we have car accidents in addition to putting out a fire. Where's this? Keystone Gulch. June 2nd, 2012, I think, somewhere around there. Remember, Eric? It was about that. Smoky was barely moderate. There's still snow up on the hills. So another early season fire in this case, June 2nd. The dangers here was that it was starting to hook around, which stressed Keystone out a little bit. We had some big housing units nearby. Or if it ran up the mountain toward Go Devil and Hoot, those of you that know Keystone, Keystone's upper management was a little worried and starting to turn on snowmaking systems. So each fire is presenting its own challenges. Again, Smoky was barely moderate right here. Where's this one? Buffalo Mountain. Shelley knows this neighborhood, right? Smoky, that was June, what day was that, 12th? Travis, you remember? About June 12th last year. Here, Smoky was a little higher. We'll look at the difference in the fire. We were right at a high to very high, right on that cusp, just ready to go in burn restrictions. We'll get to that in a little bit. But we had a very angry fire with its own tactical problems, as Shelley knows, managing Buffalo Mountain Metro District. So this is when smoky is at high, or I think we were very close to very high that day. We can see we have a lot angrier fire. Just look at the color of the smoke, and obviously the proximity of the condos made it challenging for us and our whole evacuation, which Dan talked about. Which way is this tsunami going today? I think this is a classic. What is going through that man's head? Exactly what Dan had on his pictures. I live up there. You know, how am I going to go get my stuff? Am I going to have a house? That picture says a million words. I'd love to know what that man was thinking right there. Or we probably couldn't say it in public, what he was thinking. But again, unique tactical problems, and the fire danger was different on all of these. But you can see once we get into that high and very high, the fires became much more aggressive. Peak 2 fire, it went to very high that day. The fire occurred on July 5th. So you can relate some of those, the two more severe fires in 17 and 18. Smoky was at high to very high those days compared to some of the more moderate fires. Ross Wilmore and I flew over the county 3, 4, 5 years. I don't remember when this was, but Dan showed a good picture of the, look what the bugs have done. And now we're getting, and this is a great aerial shot. This is behind Eagle's Nest. Look at the blowdown up here. Adam knows that area real well. And that's why we're worried, and that's why we're having these conversations. This is our backyard. Forest Service is doing a fantastic job mitigating it where they're able to, and the county's stepped up to the plate, but this is not going away. I'd rather see that, whatever that is up there. It's nice and green. So here's some good news. The fire danger is low today. Come on, isn't that good news? Enjoy it, because it's not going to last. All right, we don't know what, but there comes every beginning of every month, and I can give you some websites. Again, you know, some of us are nerds on this and are looking at this every day, but at the beginning of each month, it will give us some fire dangers and what's going on, and it'll also give the present. So we can also look, you know, February. I'm glad that's green. That's good news. You can see we got a little problem area down in Texas, and it's buried, but Hawaii right now is at a high risk, and Puerto Rico, of all places. Every beginning of every month, it's called predictive services. We look at this to get an idea of what's ahead and what's coming our direction. And it's on the Rocky Mountain Coordination Center site, and they give a 30, 60, and 90-day forecast. Again, they're looking at climate here, not today's weather, but what are the oscillation patterns doing in the ocean, what's El Nino doing, big macro scale stuff, and we're getting 30, 60, and 90-day forecasts. The good news is, at least as far as May, we're supposed to be normal. And again, I'm not predicting weather, I'm just showing you what the people that are way smarter than I am are predicting. Looks like the southeast is having some green up. You can see Puerto Rico and Hawaii are expected to be kind of toasty. With that, there's a handout. I know you can't read that. That's why I made some handouts. What does low and moderate and high and very high mean, and how does that affect us here in Summit County? We can and will get fires when Smoky's low, and if you don't have one, share, okay? If Smoky's green or low, we can still get fires, but controlling it's going to be very easily. We can pick them up. It's usually a low-level grass fire, or it's skunking around and not doing too much. On a normal Summit County summer, you know, we have some green up in May. On a normal summer, it's May. It's nice and green, early June, until it starts to dry out in June. And then we hope we get some monsoon rains in July and August to get us back down to low. We do spend a good amount of time in the summer in moderate and high, which again is normal for Summit County. You saw with Ophir Mountain and Keystone Gulch some still fairly aggressive fires when we're at moderate. What do we do, and how do we decide how to raise it from low to moderate to high? We'll get to that, but I want to let you guys know there's a lot of coordination that goes on between the fire departments, the county, BLM, Forest Service, the state. Every week during the summer we have a conference call with 30, how many are on there, Adam? 50 people on the conference call, and we discuss this stuff. and some of the science behind it and what's going on in Mesa County, what's going on in Summit County. We know one part of the state can get rain and another can't. So we try to make a coordinated effort on that. So there's a lot behind the scenes stuff and a lot of thought, and there is no perfect solution on when to go into restrictions or when we raise Smoky from moderate to high. We do get some phone calls. It's pouring rain out and Smoky says hi. And people are like, duh, you know, smoke. The thing is, we know mountain weather. We can get a thunderstorm one day and it's raining on Smoky, and 2 hours later the sun comes out and burns stuff off. So we try to avoid moving Smoky up and down every day. The Summit Daily's been fantastic about publishing it in the paper, and thank you, Deepan, pass that on. But we try to keep Smoky somewhat stable, and there's one weather station, we'll get to that in Summit County, that gives us a good snapshot, but we all know we could be getting rain up in Breckenridge and it's bone dry in Heaney, or vice versa. So we try to look at Summit County as a whole when we're moving the fire danger signs. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. And the science may be suggesting something, but we also look at common sense. We'll go out in the woods. Eric, you bake some fuels, right, and check fuel moistures. So there's a lot going on when you see the signs moving a little bit. We start to get worried when Smoky hits high. There we do not allow open burns in Summit County, whether they're ag burns in your neck of the woods up by Pass Creek, or even bonfires people want to burn slash. Give it to Dan instead. He likes your slash. Don't burn it. But when we get to high, we pretty much cut off burning in the county unless it's in a campfire or in a fire ring and there's no restrictions in place. We get to the bottom two. We've been to very high at our last two bigger fires, Peak 2 and Buffalo. We're right between these two, and you can see they were very difficult fires to control. We had to use air. We had to call in additional help, so things start to get dicey. Summit County has only been in extreme a few times over the last decade or two, and it just blips into there for a day or two. I hope we don't see too much of that in the future, but again, I'm not going to try to predict anything. With that, let's take a look at a few more of our handouts and how we get to Smoky. There's a test on all this, you guys, so listen up. Look at this one page, says common terms, NFDRS. These are some of the measurement tools we use to decide where Smoky goes. And again, this is nerdy stuff, so hang in there, but I personally find it fascinating. We look at one, what is the ignition component on that? I'll show you the numbers, they're on the back side of this. But the ignition component, if I took 100 matches and threw them up in the air and every one of those matches started a fire, our ignition component's 100. That's bad. All right. Right after a rain, things are nice and green, our ignition component's going to drop down. If there were embers from a fire or people doing something stupid and it was down in the single digits, that means it generally is a little more moist out there, and some of our refined fuels are moist. Spread component, something, how fast is this fire going to spread? And that's the forward movement at the head of the fire. Test question, what things influence a fire's speed? Wind, okay, good, you guys can go home soon. Wind, topography, and fuel, pretty much, and the fuel moisture. So three things are driving how fast the fire is going to move. The big one we look at here, again, hang in there if you're not into this, but is what we call the energy release component, the ERC. Big nerdy stuff, but what this tells us is how hard is it going to be to fight a fire. And this is one of the primary drivers of burn restrictions, and what the Smoky sign is doing is this energy release component. And we'll get into it just a little bit, but it tells how angry is this fire going to be. The good thing, it doesn't move around too much with weird weather, but it is a very good indicator of what that fire is going to do. Another thing we look at is the burn index, and that's generally 10 times the flame length of a fire. It's going to tell us how big the flames are. If they're getting over 10, 11 feet, generally we're not going to go charging in there. We're going to do an air show. So we look at that burn index. Staffing level, I'm jumping one, that's something Adam and us can look at and say, how many people do we have? Are we well staffed? And we can move that a little bit. Kind of the people factor, if we're getting to the 4th of July weekend, Smokey may be at the high end of a moderate, but Adam's short staffed, Eric's not in town, and we're busy with 4th of July parades. We may jump our staffing level up toward a 5, which would cause Smokey to go from a moderate to a high. So we do have some human input into that. We then get an adjective rating, low, moderate, high, all this stuff, and that's coming from the science. Couple other things we look at is the drought index. You saw Dan's pictures, not good. Did you see how Texas was dark on that, on some of his pictures? They are in a severe drought in parts of Texas, and we call it the Ketch-Byron Drought Index, and it goes from 0 to 800, and it's measuring the moisture in soil about 6-8 inches down. This time of year, and in spring, it's going to be down in the single digits, 10, 15, 20, showing the soil is fairly well saturated. But as the summer progresses, or if we're in this drought, it will cause these numbers to go higher and higher and higher. If we get toward 800, that is kiln dried. There is no moisture in the soil. And we've had some of that present in the US, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, where it'll get up in the 700 range. And that just also, these are all tools, and we look at them in totality to tell us how angry that fire is going to be and how hard it is going to be to put it out. We look at atmospheric conditions, and that's what's here, the Haynes Index, and that goes from a 1 to a 6, and that tells us, are we going to get, what's the propensity for a plume-dominated fire? Those really cool things we see on TV, hopefully from TV and at a distance, not in Summit County, but as we get to a Haynes Index of 5 or 6, higher numbers, the atmosphere is conducive to a big, giant plume fire, which is difficult, if not impossible, to put out. And then for our safety, we look at the lightning activity level, the LAL, which goes from 1 to 6. 1, you're okay, go out and play golf, wave the club at God. God won't get mad. If it's 6, I wouldn't wave your 2-iron at God. You're going to go up with a bang. On the back side of this thing, and I thank you for paying attention to this, we have weather stations across the upper Colorado River from Summit County all the way to the Utah line. Pretty much the I-70 corridor is what you're seeing here. We have one good station here in Summit County, Soda Creek, out by Keystone Golf Course, and that's been a reliable station when we get it turned on in the spring, and it gives us these numbers every day. And yes, there's people like us and Eric that look at this every day and follow this and say, what do all these numbers mean? The Soda Creek station measures 2 different fuel types, our G fuels and our T fuels, which are our timber, and our T fuels are more, the sage, I think, Eric? Sagebrush, yeah. So we're measuring 2 fuel types in Summit County, which give us a good central snapshot of what the conditions are in the middle of the county at any given time. Again, we may have a thunderstorm right over that station and the rest of the county's 80 degrees. But so we have to look at things, in totality. Along the very top column, you can see some of the things it measures. I'll translate them briefly for you. But about part of the way down, you see it says 1H, 10 FM, HUFM. Those are the fuel moistures depending on what type of fuel it's the thickness of the fuel. Our 1-hour fuels are grasses. And why is that different than timber? Because a brief rain will take the grasses and bring the fuel moisture way up, and things are good, but if the sun comes out in as little as 1 hour, the grass can dry out. Picture a large spruce tree, this big. That takes thousands of hours to react to what the weather's doing and how it soaks up moisture or gives it up. So we look at the different fuels, whether it's flashy, skinny fuels or bigger fuels. And then you can see along the top column some of the acronyms, IC, ignition component, ERC, we talked about, KBDI, spread length, severity level, all that stuff. And this Soda Creek will recommend a Smokey level for us. You can see this was taken on October 13th. Smokey was moderate for one fuel and low in another fuel, which is probably normal for October. So we look at this every day and say what's going on. And we also look at the weather, what's predicted, and what's going on in neighboring counties. So a lot of science goes into this. Now this is, how am I doing on time? All right. This leads to the discussion on when does smoky lead to burn restrictions. And this fancy colored chart, which you're going to say, what are you giving me here? We like this thing because we look at different fuel groups and we say, what is this thing telling us? But let's translate a little bit. This is measuring the energy release component on timber, these SIG charts that we use. And we may get, well, first of all, let's look at some of our bad years. Look at the brown line, 2012, bad year, right? We all remember 2012, Colorado had some issues. 2002's on here. Hayman fire, coal seam fire, Trinidad complex, another bad year, some of Colorado's worst years. 2018, right up there, isn't it? So I don't know what's with even number years. Let's hope an odd year this year will buy us some relief. The gray line is our average, so you can see we are pretty much above average all of 18. And then the minimum, a nice wet year. When we get wet years, that's kind of nice. We got our blue line. This is a representative of what's going on at several of these weather stations, not just Summit County. But it is a very useful tool. Now you can see when the energy release component gets above the number 48-ish on this, it says 90th. What is that? That's our 90th percentile. So we're looking at the history on these weather stations, and when we're getting into the 90th percentile, above that, it's getting to be a relatively rare occurrence. So the history that is accumulated by these weather stations, we put it in a percentile fashion, and when we start hitting 90, we start to get worried and we start to have fire restriction talks. And we look at not only the timber fuels, but the aspen and some of the sage, all the different fuel models. There's a bunch of these charts, if you will. So we use this as a tool. So it's not just a bunch of politicians or fire chiefs or Forest Service folks sitting in a room. I feel like going in restrictions. No, we're using the science to the extent possible. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, but it's a very good tool. We also look at politics. If it's 4th of July weekend, bad weekend to have fires, right? So we might consider moving up restrictions. Is the 90th percentile a good threshold? I don't know, because it's always been 90th percentile. But we're talking with Summit County and Forest Service folks. Should it be 85? Should it be 75? We don't know, but we're using some of the historic thresholds and when big fires occurred. When it gets up to the 95th, 97th percentile, bad. All right, and we did hit that when we went into stage 2 this summer. So a lot of stuff that goes on that doesn't meet the eye, and I thought, based on your comments, it's a good topic to bring up. And what is going to come up this summer? When are we going to be in restrictions? I have no idea. I'm hoping we're following that blue line, or at least the gray line this summer. But are some of these weird colors the new norm, as Dan showed us with the Drought Index and the state of the forest, and more people coming into the high country? I have no idea. But some interesting science here. Want to let you know there's a lot of thought that goes into it and a lot of phone calls to make sure we're communicating one message to the public, and to the extent possible that there's one set of rules on what you can do in your backyard as opposed to Adam's backyard, as opposed to state lands. So we do try to make that as coordinated as possible. It's not always identical, but to the extent possible, we do that. And next time you're going to light a fire, make sure you got a way out. So with that, I save 7 minutes for questions, Brad, wherever you guys want to go with that for Dan and I. Deep hand. Thank you.
We like